Well, Evert Bopp is the founder and CEO of Disaster Tech Lab, a company that helps local organizations around the world when disaster strikes. I asked him about the most important trends he's seeing in disaster technology.
Communications is a big area, and there's lots of different technological developments in ranging from communication systems that are used by responders on the ground to satellite-based communication to get the data from the affected areas to remote offices and remote planning teams. Another area that we're seeing a lot of development in is imagery, and specifically drone imagery, where not so much the larger drones, but even more the smaller UAVs, the so-called quadcopters that you even see in the shops nowadays, are actually being used to gather visual data of the scale of disaster or the impact of disaster and share that data very, very rapidly.
Now, when it comes to people who are at the forefront of getting this technology to market, or people who are really developing it, what companies are really leading the way, and what countries also?
Initially, if we go back a few years, when technology started to make inroads into disaster response, the US was one of the countries that was initially leading the way, with a number of the large tech companies such as Cisco. Google was involved in things like digital mapping and data gathering, but it kind of seems to be moving towards Asia much more. We did with Disaster Tech Lab, we did a few responses in disasters following, for instance, in the Philippines last year and the year prior to that. We're in Vanuatu, we're in Nepal at the moment, and we see that there's a really good trend towards what's called public-private partnership, where the local and the national governments work together with private sector companies, technology companies specifically, to develop new technologies that can be used in the application, not so much, well, also in the response effort, but what's also really growing towards is actually what we call the resilience and the preparedness side of it, where new technologies are being used to make communities more resistant and more prepared for future disasters. Because as we look at such things as Japan, we look at, also certainly China, the Philippines, those kind of countries in that part of the globe is susceptible to a lot more natural disasters that unfortunately cannot be prevented. So the big challenge there is to become more prepared. You see companies that are working in shelter rebuilding or house rebuilding, and there's a number of companies in Asia and in the US are building on concept of quickly deployable, almost prefab type housing that is very much resistant to extreme weather events or flooding and those kind of situations. So that's a really interesting area.
Tell us, when you're actually on the ground, what are some of the difficulties when you're first deployed into these disaster areas?
The most obviously difficulty is actually getting to the affected areas, because a lot of the large NGOs and smaller organizations like ourselves, you land initially in one of the major airports in one of the larger cities. That on the face of things quite often might look like the main disaster zones, because you have a large concentration of people that are affected by disaster. But once you look beyond that and you go to the more remote areas, you see people quite often who fall to the holes of the net of the traditional relief effort, but who are just as severe, if not more severe, affected. So transport is a big issue. Another issue is the communication. Obviously, like when you use radio communications, you're bound by a certain amount of licensing depending on what kind of radio spectrum you use. So we have to be prepared, if you work on an international level, that you use equipment that is compliant with the local standards. A certain amount of coordination is important with the local authorities, but also what's really valuable is working together with local private sector operators, be it logistic operators, be it telecommunications providers. And if you get a right mix there and you plan your response much better, that's a very valuable approach.